So to think about the end of the Cold War order, I want to focus not on technology or the end of the Cold War itself, but on two defining features of this era: sexual revolution and migration and immigration, both expressed through popular culture. Now, if we remember, this moment begins with the explosion of May 68, a hugely important moment that was in fact a global movement, whether it be in Europe or Africa or in the United States. And your textbook covers some of that. And here, I would like you to watch the two very short videos that I have posted: a documentary on the May 68 uprising in Paris, and archival footage of the riots in Paris, because they give us a sense of how the social and political order was challenged. They also give us a sense of how this new generation, the baby boomer generation, wanted to do away with the conventions and the conservatism, including the sexual conservatism of the post-war era, and the hope that the world could change. Now, this led to the emergence of what we call second wave feminism, as well as lesbian and gay rights movement. Now, feminism emerged in the 60s after 1968 and the 70s as a powerful cultural and political force. It challenged gender norms. It was also the most successful of political movements because it led to the legalization of contraception and abortion. But it certainly emerged out of the larger context of social protest movements: the anti-nuclear movements, which emerged in the 50s, the emerging environmental movement, of course, anti-colonial and liberation movements, and the student movements that you saw in May 68. So it drew its inspiration and energy from civil rights movements all around the globe. So in France, as in elsewhere in Europe, women threw themselves in protest movements, took part, but soon realized that in the leftist movements, women were often expected not to be political comrades, but serve as domestic auxiliaries, doing cleanup, providing refreshments, performing clerical and secretarial work for activist groups, as well as being sexually available. So they challenged the sexism of both the university, as in May 68, and the masculine privilege of the student movement, which was supposed to be about the undoing of society's inequalities, but relegated women to second-class status yet again. So by the end of the 60s, many women had split off from their male comrades, founding feminist groups on those very issues. Now, we have them all around the world. Many groups assumed a collective organization, replacing hierarchy and individual leaderships. And the movement didn't just attract young women or students, but also housewives and women working outside of the home. And this movement tackled many issues: housework, the second shift, child rearing, childcare, unequal pay, segmentation of the labor force, reproductive rights, healthcare, and the sexual revolution. But it also had to meet a number of challenges and conflicts from within. Women in the French feminist movement were at odds with lesbians who, despite being the political force behind campaigns for the legalization of contraception and abortion, were consistently marginalized within the movement. Or with the amnesia and marginalization of feminists of color that were trying to advocate for the recognition of issues particular to women of color, say in France, about having had to live with the aftermath of decolonization, and an intersection with questions that relate more to working class politics and politics of economic equality. So this is what leads to the most successful movements in the 60s and 70s. That is, in France, for instance, the legalization of contraception in the mid 60s, in part led by Simone de Beauvoir. So contraception was legalized in 1967, and the abortion bill legalizing abortion was passed in Parliament in 1974. This is, again, a global movement, and that in fact challenged so much and brought a huge amount of political and social change. And at the same time, you have gay liberation movements that are bringing to the fore the fact that they are oppressed, they're criminalized, and marginalized. For instance, in the 1971 manifesto of the Gay Liberation Front in London, it says, gay people are oppressed. We face the prejudice, hostility, and violence of straight society. And the opportunities open to us in work and leisure are restricted compared with those of straight people. Shouldn't we demand reforms that will give us tolerance and activity? Certainly we should. And this is the least we should ask for. They are our civil rights. But gay liberation does not just mean reform. It means a revolutionary change in our whole society. It means freeing our hand. The starting point for our liberation must be to rid ourselves of the oppression which lies in the head of every single one of us. By freeing our heads, we get the confidence to come out publicly and proudly as gay people and to win over our gay brothers and sisters. Now, of course, this was extremely important, not just culturally, ideologically, politically, but in very real sense, so that there was no longer criminalization of male homosexuality, the age of consent was lowered, and a whole set of reforms that had to do with the sexual revolutions, accompanied by reform trying to address unequal pay. For instance, women's wages in Britain rose by 74% in the 1970s and 80% in the 1990s, but also challenging the very ways in which gender and sexual inequality traverses the whole of society. However, things take a different turn by the end of the 1970s, because only 10 years later, the post-war prosperity that seems to have lasted almost 3 decades after 1945 is apparently crumbling, and things seem to be bleak. For instance, in Britain, Margaret Thatcher, who has become prime minister, inaugurates programs of austerity, which devastate entire communities, especially if they are working class, and is designed to hollow out the welfare state. This, again, your textbook mentions. And culturally, we see this being expressed in different ways. So, in fact, we see the emergence of 2 forms of music that reflect these changes. And the first is punk, which became a global phenomenon. And I encourage you to stop the video to watch and listen to the Sex Pistols, Anarchy in the UK, performing in Dallas, Texas in 1978, and to think of the lyrics, the types of music, and to think as to what this music is doing. So now that you've listened, we can see how this music is a revolt against the context of Thatcherite Britain, against a youth that, unlike 10 years earlier, seemed to no longer see any hope, that wanted to burn down the establishment, that no longer had the optimism of changing it. And at the same time, people express this in different ways, because another form of music swept the world alongside punk, and that was disco. Now, disco has roots like punk much earlier, but here I invite you to stop the video and watch this incredibly popular French disco singer, Claude François. Now, once you've seen, I want you to think about the fact that the king of French disco, who choreographed and staged his own videos, is in fact in this song, if you read the lyrics, calling nostalgically for France's lost empire. But even though you may not think so, even disco was political. On the surface, it seems to be pure escapism, but in fact, it began as a form of music inaugurated in working class Black and Latinx communities in the US. Disco, in fact, comes alongside the sexual revolutions that emerged in the 60s and 70s. At first, it was an anthem for queer communities with song lyrics that encouraged to live one's life and metaphorically and physically come out of the closet. Remember the 1971 Gay Liberation Manifesto, "We have to free our heads." And I invite you to watch Sylvester, You Make Me Feel, 1978. And think again of the lyrics and the video in relation to this context. Now, again, it's important to think that what disco represents, very much like punk, is in fact a form of popular music, popular culture that is first grounded and embraced by the working classes. And indeed, the famous film Saturday Night Fever is in fact the sad and tragic story of a young Italian-American working class man played by John Travolta, who has no prospects in life and finds joy only in his Saturday night disco extravaganzas. But disco, like punk, will become a global phenomenon. And in doing so, will be split apart on the surface from what seems to be its working class and queer roots to become mainstream, as is evidenced by the emergence and the victory of this Swedish disco band, ABBA, at the Eurovision context. And I wanted to think of the Eurovision as the aftermath of this, as in fact the result of this rebuilding of Europe after World War II and the emergence of the European Union community. And this leads us to our second large theme, that is decolonization and its aftermaths, and what happens after imperialism disagrees. And this will be featured in the part 2 of this lecture.